I was very sexually immoral as a teenager. And it started early in my life, and it was very easy for me. There was a curse on my life where immorality came easy for me. In other words, there was a bent toward that. I'm going to show you that the Lord showed me what the root of that curse was.
In this video, we will be breaking down Robert Morris' viral sermon. At the intro of this video, you heard him mention that the Lord showed him the root of what he referred to as this curse. He reveals what that root was. When you hear what the root was, what caused it, and why he said it led him to act immoral, it will blow your mind.
My rebellion took a form of immorality that I don't like to talk about much. I was very sexually immoral as a teenager. And it started early in my life, and it was very easy for me. Now, I'm going to share something with you that I've really had to struggle with sharing the details, things that I'm going to be sharing with you today. But when I say it was easy for me, I was very immoral, and I was immoral a lot. And I can remember a conversation with my friends, and they said, one of them said, you're just blessed. That's what they said. Because we would go out and meet girls, and I would end up being immoral just in one night. And so they began actually, it's so horrible to share this because of what the word blessed means to me now. And that I've written a book called The Blessed Life, and it's about giving, not taking. And it's about giving to give, not giving to get. So it's the total opposite of the way I was before I met Christ.
Take note that he said he was that way before he met Christ.
Here's what I've realized. I was not blessed, I was cursed. There was a curse on my life where immorality came easy for me. In other words, there was a bent toward that. I'm going to show you that the Lord showed me what the root of that curse was. The reason I'm going to show you is because I think if there's a bent toward your life toward a certain sin, maybe God could show you the root, and you could cut the root off and not have that fruit anymore. You understand what I'm saying? I learned to lie and manipulate. Because I also had rejection, I didn't want to be rejected. So I looked for the girls that would be the most susceptible. And I learned how to spot this in girls. I looked for girls that did not have a good relationship with their father. I learned to spot that. I looked for girls that were insecure.
Is this something he saw in Cindy? Now he is going to talk about the root, and then he is going to share a very sad story about what happened to his grandfather. He uses that story to pull on the emotions of the people. He then claims that this is where the root came from, which he says caused him to go down an immoral path. I think this is deceptive and seems to be an excuse for his actions, without ever taking full responsibility for them.
And I asked the Lord after I got saved, God, what was the root? Why? You know, they said I was blessed. I know I wasn't blessed. I was cursed. Multiple affairs. And I don't understand this, God. And so what was the root? What was the open door in my life? And I want to show you a scripture I showed you a few weeks ago, but it's going to kind of shock you when you see this. Hebrews 12, verses 15 and 16 says, looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. This word means morally defiled. Many, this is my life. What you're reading this verse is my life. Many became morally defiled. Now watch the very next verse, but it's the same sentence, and I just want to take the first 5 words. Lest there be any fornicator.
So he is saying that the Lord showed him that the root of bitterness was the cause of his sexual immorality. But is that what Hebrews 12 verses 15 through 16 saying? Let us look at this verse. Hebrews 12 verses 15 through 16 says, see to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. See that no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau, who for a Single sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. Verse 15, see to it that no one falls short of the grace of God. This phrase is a call to the Christian community to ensure that everyone continues to live in God's grace. It emphasizes the importance of mutual care and encouragement within the community of believers, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. This is a warning against allowing bitterness or resentment to take root in one's heart. Such negative emotions can spread and cause significant harm within a community, leading people away from God's grace. Verse 16, see that no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau. The writer of Hebrews cautions against sexual immorality and godlessness, using Esau as an example. In the Bible, Esau is depicted as someone who prioritized immediate physical satisfaction over his spiritual heritage, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. This refers to the story in Genesis where Esau, driven by hunger, sold his birthright to his brother Jacob for a meal. The birthright included not just material inheritance, but also spiritual blessings and responsibilities. Esau's actions are used as a cautionary tale of how easily one can forsake something of great value for temporary satisfaction. These verses emphasizes the importance of vigilance in maintaining one's faith and the well-being of the Christian community. It warns against the dangers of bitterness, sexual immorality, and godlessness. The passage encourages believers to value their spiritual heritage and responsibilities, rather than trading them for temporary, earthly pleasures. So is this passage saying that bitterness is the cause of sexual immorality? No, it is not. These verses addresses bitterness and sexual immorality as separate.
Don't let a root of bitterness spring up, or many will be morally defiled, because there will be a fornicator among you.
That is not what that passage of scripture is saying. This is very deceptive. And this is why it is very important to study the context of Scripture to avoid being deceived.
I was the fornicator.
Not only were you a fornicator, but also an adulterer.
And I believe this open door in my life was because there was a root of bitterness in our family.
He is going to tell a story about what happened to his grandfather. I am only going to play a little bit of it, then I will give my commentary at the end.
And when I share with you what happened that I've never shared publicly, and I got my mother's permission to share this week, you'll understand why there was bitterness in our family. About my grandfather, who was named Robert Bach, and I'm named after him. He owned a dairy farm, but they started a church in their home. My grandfather started a church, founded a church planter among the Pawnee Indians. My grandfather then started the Trinity Baptist Church in El Dorado, Arkansas, in his home. And he would preach until they got a pastor, then they got a building. They took a metal building, disassembled it from a guy's house. They bought some land, they put it on the land, put it up, and that's where the church came from. But it started in my grandfather's home. He had built a little rent house on his property. He rented it to a woman named Mrs. Brown. Mrs. Brown had 2 children. It was only a little 1-bedroom rent house. And she eventually rented the house on the other side of my grandparents. So she asked my grandfather if her ex-husband, they were divorced because he had mental problems. And they didn't know that at the time that he had mental problems. But she asked if he could rent the little guest house. So you have to see, my grandparents' house was in the middle. Mrs. Brown was on this side. Mr. Brown in the little rent house that my grandparents owned on this side, and he would cross their yard. And my grandfather did it because he thought that a father should be near his children. He would walk by. My mother said, I remember him walking by, but he would talk to himself when he walked by. And he started getting angry. And he eventually said something one day to my grandmother that we don't know to this day what he said, but it was inappropriate. And he said something to my grandmother, and my grandmother told my grandfather that night at dinner, and he said, I'm going to have to go down and talk to him. And I'm going to tell him that I'm going to have to bring the authorities in, and he can't live there anymore. And he felt like it's not safe for our family. So my grandfather went down to talk to him. My mother then, it was a Wednesday night, went into the bathroom to get ready. She was singing in the church choir for the choir that night. She went in to get ready, and her window was on the side of the house. The bathroom was on the side of the house where the rent house was, and the window was open. And she heard my grandfather and Mr. Brown begin arguing. And it was very violent. And so she ran in and told my grandmother. My grandmother immediately, my mother said, I remember her taking her apron off and running. And she went running down to the house. Well, as she was running to the house, she heard a gunshot, and he had shot my grandfather in the chest. She came to the house.
Look at the expressions on these people's faces. There is a reason why I am pointing this out.
And Mr. Brown said, "Don't come in or I'll shoot you too." But she went in anyway.
I will fast forward to certain sections just so we can cover where the root comes up.
He had 8 bullet holes in him, though, because one of the bullets went into his arm, came out his arm, went then in his chest, and came out his back. So he had 8 bullet holes. And then my uncle, in other words, my grandparents' son, my mother's sister, my mother's brother, heard that first shot, but he was in the dairy. And he took off running, and then he heard the 2 shots on his way. And when he got to the house, he called for his father, and Mr. Brown said, "Don't come in here or I'll kill you too." And so he waited. He didn't know if his parents were dead or what. He didn't know. He just knew there had been 3 shots. My grandfather then realized he's going to kill, I'm going to die. He's going to kill my wife. He's going to kill my son. So my grandfather, with 3 bullets, 3 shots, held him down, held this man down, and then called for his son, my uncle, to come in and get the gun away from him. But my grandfather held him down with 3 shots in him. And my mother, when she heard the shot, she said, I knew what had happened. And so she called for an ambulance. Back then, there's no 911. You call an operator and it has to be connected. So then she said when she came out of the house, she saw my uncle, her brother, and my grandmother, her mother, bringing my grandfather up to the house, and blood all over his front of his shirt, and blood all over them.
Look at his facial expression.
She said he was in so much pain, and he was now coughing up blood. So the ambulance came, and they took him to the hospital. They did surgery on him most of the night, and he survived the surgery. And he began to get better and better. He lived for 10 days after the shooting, and they thought he was going to go home. On Friday, 9 days after he had been shot, and again they thought he was gaining strength back and going to go home, she told him, she said, "I won't be coming to see you tomorrow on Saturday because I've gotten a job now, and tomorrow's my first day." She went to work the next day. My grandmother went to the hospital. My grandfather started having pain. For some reason, the doctor told the nurse, I don't want to come in this weekend. Do not call me. Just do not call me unless it's an emergency. But it has to be an absolute emergency. I do not want to be called. One doctor, small town. My grandfather began having pain in his chest. We know now he had a blood clot. And he began saying, I've got to have the doctor. I've got to have the doctor. The nurse said, "The doctor does not want to be disturbed. You have indigestion or something." He said, "No, something's wrong with my heart." And for 6 hours, he begged the nurse to call the doctor. And he said to my grandmother, one of the last things he said was, "If the doctor doesn't come, I'm going to die." And he did. He passed away. When the doctor did come, my grandmother said, "Why didn't you come? Why wouldn't you let the nurse call you?" His response was, "I never expected your husband to live anyway." Other doctors said if he had been given blood thinner, he probably would have lived.
Look at her facial expression.
So you can see how it was very difficult for my mother, for my family, because of this. The man that shot him was declared insane. My mother has 2 newspaper clippings about my grandfather, her father. I have a picture of those 2 clippings. The one on the right, we'll blow it up a little bit. The one on the right says local fire hero, given $50 check. This was in 1928. This is when he rescued the woman from the burning building. So this is one that he's a hero. The second one says that the man charged with slaying landlord declared insane. So we felt like the doctor could have saved his life. We felt like the man that shot him, he was insane, but the word that was used was temporary insanity. It was difficult for my mother because she said to me this Thursday, she said, "I would think anyone that shoots another human being is temporarily insane. When I was young, I asked my mother, "Why am I named Robert?" She said, "Because my father was named Robert." And I said, "Where is he?" And she started crying, and she said, "He's not here." My mother had a choice to allow that bitterness to stay in her or to turn it around. She turned it around, but I think there was still that root in our family.
I am going to stop the story here. Notice he said that his mother had a choice to have bitterness or turn it around. He said she turned it around, but he thinks there was still a root of bitterness in his family. Who is he to say that? Especially considering he just said that his mother chose not to have bitterness and turned it around. I think it's incredibly deceptive to use scripture out of context to justify his sexual immorality, and then to use a tragic story about his grandfather to manipulate his congregation by implying that his family's tragedy caused a root of bitterness, which then led to his inappropriate behavior. He also led his congregation to believe that his sexual immorality ended once he got saved, which we know is not true. Why? Because his inappropriate behavior with Cindy started when he was 21 years old, and he said in this next clip that he got saved when he was 19 years old.
I was 19 years old when I gave my life to the Lord, and everything changed. I didn't have any desire to go back to that old life. I wanted to walk with the Lord and learn more about Him.